Well, thank you for joining us for worship this morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm Dave, and one of the pastors here. And Monday this week, my wife was home. She works 2 days a week, Monday and Tuesday, and she was home from work. The kids were at daycare, and so she got a day off, fortunately. But when she picked them up, they were exhausted from their day, and she just had a pounding headache. She was putting Adam to bed. And now, I have to clarify, I told this story in the first service, and they were like, where were you? A lot of people. I was at Young Adults, it was a Monday night. I would have helped if I was there. Anyway, she had a headache, she was putting Adam to bed, and then she hears Connor yelling from the bathroom, Mommy, I need help. Okay, so she brings Adam out, he's in a sleep sack, and ready to go to sleep, and tired, exhausted. And she gets in there, and Connor hadn't made it to the bathroom on time. So there's poop in the bathroom. I didn't say this is a pretty story, did I? No. And so, naturally, Catherine has to set down Adam, who now starts screaming, Mommy, pick me up! Mommy, pick me up! And he's mad that she's setting down. And she's cleaning up the mess, and her head is pounding because she has a headache. She's got that horrible flu that's been going around. And so she's scrambling to clean up the mess and kind of fight through the chaos of it all. And then the toilet plugs. I know, it's a funny story, funny to me, not to her. Funny to us, we can look back and laugh about it now, but most of us know what real and significant chaos is like. Some of you know what it's like to lose a job, or to lose a significant relationship, or to lose a loved one to cancer. We face deadlines sometimes. This chaos can come from sort of the exhaustion when there's a deadline, and there's work, and there's family, and there's school, and that just happens to be my personal example right now. So the chaos that we experience, sometimes it's because of something we've done. We've made a poor choice, and the chaos is sort of the natural outworking of it. But sometimes the chaos we experience in life has nothing to do with us. It's because people around us have made bad choices. You think of those kids who grow up in homes of alcoholics. They're born into chaos. It's nothing to do with their choices, but other people's choices that have caused them to just experience life as falling apart. The question, though, becomes, because we all experience chaos, what do we do with it? Where do we go? How do we manage in the middle of the pressure, of the pain, or sometimes even the shame of what we've done wrong as well? This morning, that's what we're going to look at. What do we do with our chaos? It's going to be our big question. First, we need to know where the chaos comes from. Second, how we often try and deal with the chaos in broken ways themselves. And then third, how God answers our chaos. Let's just pray as we begin. Father, we're really, really thankful for this morning, for this chance to get together and worship together as we can, to sing these songs of faith, songs that call us to trust in you. And we thank you for the chance that we have to give and to serve in kids' church and to love each other and to share our lives together as well. We ask now that as we open your word, you give us hearts that are ready to hear and respond to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So first, where does the chaos come from? If you're joining us just now, we have been working through the whole storyline of the Bible, starting in September. And in the very first scene of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, we read that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in chapter 2, we read that the earth was formless and void. It was disordered, and there was nothing to fill it. And so what God is doing, what the rest of Genesis 1 tell us, is that God brings order to what is disordered, to the chaos that's there, and he brings fill to what was empty already. That's a big part of what Genesis 1 is about, God bringing order out of chaos. And we also read in Genesis 1 verse 2 that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now in an ancient worldview, waters often represented chaos or even evil. That people would see the waters as something evil. But God's just simply, he hovers over it, he brings the order out of the chaos. That's one of the first things we see as we open the Bible. And in verse 3 of chapter 1 of Genesis, God simply speaks a word and nature obeys. He's bringing form and fill with simply the word of his mouth, bringing order out of chaos. He speaks and it happens. But there's something else that is really important that comes up in chapter 1 as well. In Genesis, we read that we were intended for what the Bible calls shalom, or we translate as peace. And shalom is a fourfold harmony. I've mentioned this many times over. You'll be able to recite this off by heart soon. The fourfold harmony of relationship, first with God, with other people, with our own selves, and with the rest of creation. We were made for there to be a relationship of harmony in those places. But in just the next scene, Genesis chapter 3, we see that shalom is unraveled. Or we could say, I'm going to use the word vandalized today. Just like a vandal, you remember the Bob Dylan song? The vandals took the handles, the pump don't work anymore because the vandals took the handles. So life doesn't work as it is supposed to because it's been vandalized. That shalom has been vandalized by human choices. And you see, the man and the woman at the end of chapter 2 are in relationships, like the first marriage wedding ceremony, and it says that they were naked and they felt no shame. Because they were rightly related to the Creator God. He was the Creator, they were the creatures. And yet, in just the next chapter, they are tempted to believe that God doesn't love them. God doesn't want the best for their lives. And so they believe that, well, in order to be happy, they have to basically de-God God in their hearts. They decide to be their own masters. That's at the heart of what the Bible calls sin. Now, in the 4th century, a writer by the name of, and pastor by the name of St. Augustine, he said that sin is this: homo incurvatus in se, in Latin. It means a human turned in on him or herself, turned in, self-centered, self as focus, self in the middle. That's at the essence of what sin is. To de-God God is to say, you are no longer God, I will be God, thank you very much, of my own life and my own future. And this vandalizes shalom, and it breaks down because you know what happens? The first thing that happens to these people after they've taken and believed that and lived in disobedience to God is this. They realized they were naked. This is Genesis 3:7. They realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They experienced something they'd never experienced before. Now, just a quick question. Have you ever seen a fig leaf before? Yeah, I've seen a fig leaf, and making clothes out of fig leaves. I'm just glad we're not all wearing fig leaves this morning. Let's put it that way. This is a horrible idea. Here's the point. They try to deal with their shame. They try to deal with their guilt or sense of the unraveled shalom, the breakdown, the chaos that results on their own strength, in their own way. And it kind of works. Things are kind of going to work, but only sort of, and only in a little kind of a way. Now, let me unpack this a little bit more because I think this is actually really important for us to see in light of the whole story. They vandalized God's shalom, and there's been consequences. They try to solve their problem on their own strength in their own way. Now, in his excellent book, Dwell, Barry Jones reminds us that we have the same tendency at work in ourselves as well. In our fallen condition, we have developed a deeply ingrained strategies for coping with the vandalism of shalom. Jones tells a story. He was given a note by a 12-year-old girl after one of the services he preached. And let me read you this note. Here's what it says. My friend, she cut herself on purpose. I don't know how much pain mentally it must be in to do that. She promised me she would never do it again, but I don't know. She's wearing my bracelet I gave her temporarily. She's such a beautiful girl and fun. I can't comprehend that she did it. I hope she never does it again. And she told me that a ton of other people do it. I don't know. She needs help. She's only 12. You know, I wish this was the kind of story that we could read about in a book and say, oh, that's awful, that happens? But it's not. You know, I've worked with youth and young adults for over 10 years, and I've walked with many of them who are in the same kind of place, who don't know how to deal with the vandalism of shalom, the chaos of living in a fallen and broken world, and they cut themselves. It's a tragic coping strategy, but it is their coping strategy. It's a particular poignant example because this girl is so young and the strategy is so obviously destructive. But we have to realize this is her response to a broken world. And other people out there, our young people, feel the same way often. You know, I think we've all developed coping strategies to deal with the vandalism of shalom. We all try to make life work, but too often it's like sowing fig leaves. It's on our own strength and in our own ways. We all sow fig leaves. At times we try to deal with a sense of shame or guilt that our sin brings, but we do it like Adam and Eve do. And we keep sowing them because they work. This is important. Fig leaves work, sort of, for the moment, but not ultimately. Barry Jones suggests there's four ways that we can see that we often cope with the chaos in our world. The first is detachment. He says, we don't want to look at the mess. Now, I'm sure Catherine didn't really want to look at the mess that night on the floor and on the walls or whatever, but she did, and she did it with patience and grace. But so often, instead of dealing with the stress of life, the chaos around us, instead of dealing with the mess, we do our best to ignore it. And I think often this happens where we actually try to control situations. We try to almost deny that there is chaos by saying if we can just get it under control. So we end up trying to control situations, trying to control other people in an effort to mitigate or minimize that sense of chaos or pain. And then maintaining that illusion of control for many people is one of the greatest idols of the heart. What do I mean by idols of the heart? John Calvin said that our hearts are perpetual idol factories. We're constantly turning from God to worship other things. Control or maintaining control over people or situations is one of the primary ways that we say to God, no thank you, I'll do things on my own terms. We need control, we feel, so we grab for it. The second is strategies of distraction. Now, we ever end up scrolling on Facebook for hours? Or getting sucked into a Netflix series or a video game, not just for a few episodes, but almost for like days on end? Have you ever wondered if you were trying to escape something? If you were doing that because you didn't want to deal with the messiness of life? Instead of control, it's almost that we stop controlling, we just look to escape. We look to shiny things and overindulge maybe in shopping, or in drinking, or in eating. What we're looking to do is actually numb the pain. Social work researcher Brené Brown, in her TED Talk, that's now really a famous one, called The Power of Vulnerability. It's worth watching. But she says this. She says, we are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. Now, she is speaking in America to Americans, but I think that in many ways her research probably applies in Canada as well. We look to cheap substitutes for shalom. Cheap substitutes like, here's how Jones says it, we look to numb the pain in shopping, eating, drinking, sex, TV, busyness, achievement, applause, productivity. Yes, there's a numbing of the pain. That's one way that we seek to deal with the chaos of the world. Third are strategies of despair. Jones puts it like this: we feel completely overwhelmed by the brokenness of our lives and the world. Despair comes when our sense of control is lost and our attempts to escape leave us empty. So we give up to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. We lose the capacity to dream for a better future. That's despair. And there's strategies of destruction. Instead of numbing the pain or just simply despairing, we respond to the vandalism of shalom by becoming active participants in the vandalism. We end up becoming destructive ourselves. This can happen in a lot of different ways. It could be that we are simply hostile to other people. It could be violence toward others, or maybe it's emotional or physical or verbal abuse. Maybe it comes out in exploiting others. Or maybe it can be in a way that seems much more tasteful, but is equally destructive, in lying or in gossip. So here's a really interesting part. The question is, why do we keep coming back to these kinds of coping strategies? And I think the answer is that they work. Sort of. For the moment. You want to numb the pain? A bottle's going to do that. It will. For a moment. It'll create more and deeper and bigger problems in the end. But it will numb the pain. In the Old Testament, we saw that the people of Israel kept getting wrapped up in idolatry. Why? Why did they keep coming back to idols? Here's why. It's because they worked. They would pray for rain to some god or goddess, and it would rain sometimes. I thought, wow, that worked. Or they wanted to get pregnant, and they did. They prayed to a fertility goddess, and they got pregnant, and they think that worked. But the substitutes, these false gods, are no gods at all. It didn't matter if it was true, it just mattered if it worked. But what if there is such a thing as truth? The substitutes of shalom, they don't give us what we're actually after. And the unfolding storyline of the Bible tells us that God is so desperate to really give us the peace, the shalom that we are after, that he will give everything to make that a reality. The problem that caused the vandalism of shalom in the first place, the incurvatus in se, the turning in on ourselves, is not going to be solved by more turning in on ourselves. We need to look to the one who created us for himself, to live in the way of shalom as he's called us to. So back to our question, what do we do with our chaos? It's still the right question. And as we've seen, God initiates a plan from outside of ourselves. He sends his son, Jesus, to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. We're going to pick up in Mark's Gospel this morning with our remaining time. In Mark chapter 4, if you want to turn there, verse 35. And now, Jesus has just been talking and sharing parables with his disciples about what the kingdom of God is like. And then we come up against this story. Let me read it for you. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowds behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. And now, as I was reading, I thought, well, I wouldn't have written it like that, Mark. That's pretty odd. There were other boats with with his boat, with him. Jesus is made the subject of everything in Mark's Gospel. I kind of flipped through and I said, wow, Mark just keeps bringing everything is centered around Jesus. Even, they don't just say he's around his boat, it's around Jesus himself. Interesting point, but Jesus seems to be the center, even in the syntax, even in the grammar of the language that Mark uses. Look at verse 37. What happens? Here's what happens. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. What a guy. The disciples woke him and said, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Notice what they call him. Teacher or rabbi in Aramaic, as they would have been saying it. Rabbi, don't you care about us? Don't you care that we might drown? In verse 39, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. And they listened. The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Jesus questioned, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Now, faith, we need to realize, means trust. It can be translated either way from the Greek. Faith means trust. And trust or faith has to have an object, a thing that we trust in. You know, sometimes people talk generically about faith. Man, you just got to believe, or you just got to have faith. My question is always, in what? In who? You might remember that Susie McNeil song. I thought about singing it. It's kind of might not go very well. You know, that if you just believe, you can move mountains with dreams. Really? With dreams? I can move mountains with dreams? Wow. That's great, Susie. That sounds great for coming-of-age movies or pop songs. But these guys are facing death. They're going to need more than their dreams about the future to trust Him. You and I are going to face death. You're going to need more than your dreams to trust in Him too. You see, He asks in the middle of their chaos. Their chaos is real. These are fishermen. They've been in a boat all their lives. They understand this. Have you ever been in a boat that's taken on water? I have. Done some whitewater canoeing. When it fills up, it gets tippy. It either goes under or it turns over. They say, don't you care that we're going to drown? They're not overreacting. They are facing death. And in the face of death, what are they going to do? What do they do with their chaos? So Jesus asks, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? He's asking you if they'll trust Him. Why would they be terrified, see, if they knew who He was? But they're struggling to trust Him because they don't know who He is. Look, what's the response to the storm? To Him stilling the storm, rather. What do they say? They say, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey Him. This is the most important question you're going to ever answer in your life, is who is Jesus? Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey Him. Yes, like at the creation, when Jesus speaks, nature itself listens. We sang that in Fairest Lord Jesus. Fairest Lord Jesus, ruler of all nature. And notice what happens when the storm is calmed. Notice how happy they are and how grateful. They're like cheering, right? Just look at the text. No, they're not. They're terrified. Why are they terrified? See, the storm on the outside was raging, and He stilled it with a word. Now the storm is on the inside of them. Who am I sitting next to in this boat? And He can speak to the wind and the waves, and they listen. The storm is now raging on the inside for these guys. But Jesus doesn't want His disciples to be scared. He wants them to trust Him. He wants them to realize who He is, and He wants your trust too. And we can only trust Him if we recognize who He is. He's essentially saying to His disciples, if you knew who I was, you wouldn't need to be afraid of the storm. Trust me in the chaos. Now, here's the interesting thing. When Jesus gets to the other side of the lake, we see chaos ensue again. So they get out of the boat and they run into a guy. And it's a tragic story. Look at verse 5 of chapter 5. There's a man that they see, and he's living in chaos. Night and day, it says, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. It's a sad picture of someone living under the influence of evil. It says that he had many demons in him. What's he doing with his chaos? What's he doing with the vandalism of shalom he's experiencing in life? He's crying. He's cutting himself. His despair and destruction. The chaos of the storm in the last scene is now being connected with and contrasted with chaos of life under the influence of evil forces. But look what we read next. When he, that's the man, saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell to him on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Wait, what did the disciples call Jesus? Teacher. Ah, good teacher. You're a teacher, rabbi, like other rabbis are. The evil one inside of this man recognized Jesus' true identity. Recognized who Jesus really was, the Son of the Most High God. And he was terrified. The demon was terrified. And he begins to say, "Please don't cast me out." He understands the authority that Jesus has as the Son of the Most High God because he understands his identity. And in his great mercy, Jesus, the Son of the living God, he graciously frees this man from the grip of evil. We read in verse 15, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Again, the fear. Why? Because who is this who has authority like that? Imagine if you were hiking with a friend. We'll just put it this way. And a storm came up, and the winds were crashing, and trees were starting to fall over. I have a friend here who almost got hit by a tree hiking with his family a few years ago. Yeah, serious question. Lightning is crashing, trees are starting to be blown over, and you're scared. And you're with your group of friends, and one of them says, quiet, be still, and the storm stops. For you would be terrified too, I think. Maybe even more terrified than the storm that's been going on outside would be your question of who is this? I think what Mark is trying to do in this section of his gospel is show us who Jesus is so that we can really trust him. He's not explaining it in theological language or propositional truths. He does it by showing us through his actions. You know, we do get some theological language and propositional truths about Jesus. He makes some claims about himself and his divinity, in John's gospel in particular. But I think most of the way that Jesus reveals who he is through his actions. There was once a great ballerina, and she was an amazing dancer. After one of her great performances, someone came up to her afterwards, and with the audacity, they said, "That was nice, but what did it mean?" To which she replied, "If I could have said it, I wouldn't have had to dance it." That's how art works. Art's about expressing, about saying something that mere explanation in words simply can't communicate. Like the art, sometimes meaning comes best not in the explanation, but in the dance, in actions and symbols that hint at and point to a fuller reality. So here's something we need to understand about Jesus. Jewish people, like Jesus and his disciples, they worship the one true God of Israel, Yahweh. They had no expectation that God would actually become a human being. They had no category for that. So how will Jesus communicate the fullness of his identity, in fact, the fullness of his divinity to his followers? How does he reveal who he really is? Well, in a sense, by dancing. Now, I don't mean literally dancing, although he probably did that at times too. He went to wedding parties and such. But he shows us who he is through his actions. If I could have said it, I wouldn't have had to dance it, essentially. See, that's what the forgiving of sins is about. That's what the stilling of the storm is about. The feeding of the 5,000, the walking on the waves. Those are things that only Israel's God, Yahweh, can do. And here Jesus shows up and he starts to do them himself. All these actions are what the God of the Old Testament alone can do. And think of it, feeding the 5,000. You've got a group of people in the wilderness who have no food, and they're miraculously fed food. Where have we ever seen that story before? This is the story of the Exodus, right? God's people are in the desert, and they're hungry, and they're fed miraculously. Jesus is saying, you know, when Yahweh fed the people like that in the desert, so too I stand here in front of you now and do the same for you. See, it's largely Jesus' actions. By doing the things that only God can do, that's how Jesus shows who he is. See, not only is he the Son of God, as the Jehovah's Witnesses, they can affirm that statement, but he is God, the Son, the second member of the triune Godhead. Jesus will make verbal claims and hints at his identity to be God himself with skin on, mostly in John's Gospel, and Jordan's going to talk about that next week a bit. But the clearest ways, I think, Jesus shows us who he is through his actions. When he calms the storms and speaks to the waves, what do his Jewish audience hear? What do they see? They hear Genesis chapter 1. That with a word God speaks and nature listens. They hear Jonah. When Jonah's thrown overboard, God brings the stillness to the storm. Order out of chaos with just a word, and he's sitting next to us in the boat. That's why they're terrified. Could it really be? Who calms the storms with a word? Who brings order out of chaos? God alone. And here's Jesus sitting with us in the boat. It's in the actions that Jesus shows us he is recreating the world. Just as in Genesis 1, God creates with a word, bringing the waters of chaos into order. Now Jesus again speaks a word and is bringing forth a new creation. In the casting out of the casting of the demons from the man, he's showing us what he intends for all of us to experience freedom and new life and healing. Yes, Jesus offers us this as a sign that he is recreating the world and that he has the authority to do it. Why? Because he is God the Son. Sometimes when I talk about Jesus with people, they'll ask me questions like, well, how can you say, as a Christian, that Jesus is God? Because don't you believe in one God? And say, yes. Well, then how can God be Father, and God be Son, and God be Holy Spirit? Does that mean there's three gods? And so it starts as a conversation about God and turns into a conversation about grade 1 arithmetic. 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. Does that make sense? No, you know what? Theology is not math. Certainly not grade 1 arithmetic. If grade 1 arithmetic could answer our questions about how God is 3 in 1, I don't think he would be God anymore. That's not who we wouldn't be talking about God anymore, that's for sure. But what the early church realized after Jesus' resurrection, and what we still affirm as Christians today, is that Jesus is actually God with us. And because of that, we can trust him with our chaos. Trust him. These early Christians trusted him when they lost their land and their jobs and their family members and even their own lives to tell and live this story of amazing love. And that's why people today, the persecuted Christians around the globe, they too face the loss of land and jobs and family members and their own lives to tell and live this story. What do they do with their chaos? Well, they believe that God, through Jesus, is reversing it. That God really will recreate the world. That in Jesus, God is bringing order out of chaos. Like the man who had the demons removed from his life, God is still freeing people from our destruction and despair to live lives that are healed and that are hopeful. The question is, what do you do with your chaos? Will you come to Jesus as he really is? Rather than sowing fig leaves, rather than seeking control or escape or despair or destruction, in the middle of your chaos, would you come to the one who stepped into the chaos, became one of us, and let his life descend into chaos on the cross so that he could bring order out of your chaos? Would you trust in that God today? He's still asking us, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? Do you still not trust me? I had a conversation with a friend this week who was dealing with a difficult and painful situation. And she was really wrestling with, how do I do this in the way that God is asking me to? So she came to me and we had a great conversation. And she shared that in the middle of the chaos, she had a tendency to try to just smooth things over and make everyone around her happy rather than actually deal with the issues. My encouragement was probably not immediately encouraging. I told her she was probably going to have to walk through the messiness of it, that she was going to have to lean into the pain that this issue was bringing to her. Instead of minimizing it or ignoring it, it was in the pain, in the situation that God wanted to work. In the situation that God wanted to meet her, to be her Lord, to work in her heart. It's like what Frederick Buechner says. He says, we are never more alive to life than when it hurts. More aware of both our powerlessness to save ourselves and of at least the possibility of a power beyond ourselves to save us and heal us if we can only open ourselves to it. Will you open your life to the God who longs to bring order to your chaos? And can I say that it's often in the middle of that pain that we realize our powerlessness to save ourselves. It's in that place that we have to open our lives to his healing and help. But what we do when we face that pain matters deeply. Will we sow more fig leaves, or will we trust the captain, the storm? Here's what I'm going to invite you to do for the next just minute and a half. I want us to think through the implications. What if Jesus is who he's claiming to be through his actions here? Here's our question, just in the next slide here. What difference would it make? How might we live differently if we came to see that Jesus really was the one who can bring order out of chaos, who is bringing about a new creation? And how would your life change if you believed that? What I want you to do is maybe just sit quietly for the next minute on your own and think through that prayerfully. Or, and here's what I'd love to encourage you to do, is if you're comfortable with it, maybe turn to your neighbor 2 or 3 people around you, and just chat through that a little bit. What would change in your life if you believed that? So just take a minute to do that now. Right, I've asked you to be brave, to maybe talk with somebody next to you. I'm going to ask you to be really brave. And in maybe a sentence or just a few words or a sentence or two, maybe you could share some of your answer. What do you think would change for us if we could believe that Jesus can bring order out of the chaos, that he can meet us in the middle of the chaos and be the captain of the storm? What are some of the things that you're thinking? Now we're going to have about 5 seconds of awkward silence, and then someone's hand's going to shoot up, and we'll get the ball rolling, okay? And then it's awkwardness. Who's going to go first?
We would pray more.
We would pray more. I do, Harry, when I begin to, again, trust Jesus. If I start dealing with things on my own, I think we would pray more, yes. Yeah?
We also would see it more like a learning experience, like Christ maybe has more of himself.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so we would see the chaos as a chance to meet God and see what he's like and have him transform us. I think so. I think that's what the chaos is for. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
It would be more effective because I'm not doing it alone.
Yeah, because you're recognizing that God is with me. That's right.
Like it gives me much more power.
It's empowering to know that God is with me. And whatever I'm facing, I'm not on my own. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, amen.
Would be more in peace, like would be peaceful, and as the song says, Spirit lead me where like my process or
Yeah.
that's the thing.
Yeah, we'd be more peaceful, and we might be more willing to take on, as the song is saying, step out in faith into maybe a bigger challenge than we ever thought in what God is calling us to, trusting that he can give us the resources to care in the way we need to. Yeah, how about up in the balcony? Anyone up there want to overlook you guys? Yeah, someone? Yeah.
We would have patience in chaos.
Yes, we would. Because we can entrust ourselves to the one who's the captain. I don't have to have everything under control all the time. That, for me, that's where patience comes in. Patience is when I want to see something happen right away. Or patience, my impatience is when I want to see it happen right away. My patience comes when I trust that God is actually good and in control. Yeah, of the storm. Thank you. Speak to the chaos and say, you know what? You don't run my life. Jesus does. Yeah, my mother-in-law had this thing on her work computer I remember seeing when I was her chemistry student before she was my mother-in-law, or that I knew she would be my mother-in-law. And it said, don't say to God how big your mountains are, say to your mountains how big your God is. Kind of a similar idea there. Yeah. One more.
I think we would begin to understand what the power of the gospel is, that it can actually transform our lives and transform our world.
Yeah.
So often our understanding, I feel, is in a get out of hell free card,
Right.
whereas no powers to transform us and those around us.
Yes. Absolutely. And that's the last point that I'm going to end on, because that's where we're going. That's what I came up with too, so thank you. How we defeat the incurvature of the soul, the incurvatus and say, how do we live differently than that in the midst of the chaos? Instead of just contributing to the chaos, is to turn our lives outward. I had a conversation, I bumped into a friend of mine, Mel Gall, they're here, and they have their kids, and it's amazing. I couldn't believe it. They made it this morning. They just had twins, and they've already got 3. I heard a joke recently from a guy who said, yeah, having 4 kids, people say, what's that like? And he says, well, imagine you're drowning. You're drowning, and then someone hands you a baby. So, someone handed them 2. I can't imagine. And so I saw her on her own walking to Starbucks where I was writing this sermon that day, and I said, Mel, you're up, you're here. How are you? And, they're tired, and they've had a lot to work with. But she said she was so thankful, almost in a sense beaming, can I say that? In a way, as she started to talk about how people from our church had stepped up to help them. And she said, what's really interesting is how often people would leave our house after helping out, and they would be saying, thank you for the opportunity to come and help you. What? What's that about? It's because we're never more who we're called to be in Christ than when we're serving other people. We defeat the incurvature of the soul by turning it outwards, by trusting in the one who gave his life outwardly to buy us back for himself, experiencing the recreative power of that, and then getting on with forming our lives, shaping our lives after the one who leads us in the way of the cross. And we become people of the way of the cross, who are about giving outward, who are about lives that are open. Barry Jones says it well. He says, one of the ways we become people of the outward turn is not surprisingly by turning outward. We become people whose lives are characterized by giving ourselves away for the glory of God and the good of other people. And slowly but persistently, over time, we begin to overcome the incurvature of the soul. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. We've kind of run out of time. I got carried away, I'm sorry. And they're going to lead just an amazing... You do what you want. You do what you want. You guys okay for like 7 more minutes? Yeah, you are, to worship. And I want to invite you to pray. As we're singing these next songs, would you talk to God about what he's asking of you in the middle of this? If you want to pray with me or someone else, you can just talk to your neighbor. Harry's over here. Other people that you can pray with, just grab someone from the stage. I don't know. But we're going to take some time and connect with God in response to the captain of the story.